Good morning. Welcome back to the next episode. Last time we just set up kind of like, I guess, the immediate GUI stuff, right? Like the kind of basic, I need a button, and when I click it, it needs to know it's been clicked, etc., etc. I guess what I've been doing since, kind of applying that, starting to think about how we're going to actually build the game. Oopsie daisy. So this is what we got now. So this looks probably quite familiar. All the same behaviors work. One thing that I did miss in the last version of this is that if I click outside of a region and I drag across, I've now got it set so that also doesn't trigger elements. There was a handmade hero tip caught me there. And this is something that's vaguely roguelike looking. You can see we can draw each character in a different color. On click, they highlight with their draw color, which I think is quite neat. And we get this logging output to say where in the grid was clicked. So we've got the kind of relevant information. We have other buttons over here, and everything's laid out kind of easily. If I click the player, then we get a handler. And if I click a spot they can move to, it'll move. If I click a wall, it won't move. These dark grey dots are floor, so they can move. And I think that's basically all of the new functionality you can see here. So if I try to click more than one tile away, it fails, which I think in sort of game design terms will eventually want a click there to work like a click here and then a click here. But I think there's reasons that make that non-trivial once we start adding monsters. So we're going to add that later. But yeah, and then exiting and quitting works. And that's the bulk of the change, really. One thing I did do is I set up. So I've got. I've been tagging the releases or the commits at the point where I make the video. So this is Dev 8, I think, and I've been asking for an AI agent to just read all of that, make me a summary of the changes, so we can have a quick look in here. So at a high level overview of what's changed, got the world and player movement, what I've just kind of shown, and then some bits under the hood. I find it very funny. It always talks about things in such like big terms. I've split some files that are getting a bit big. We'll go look at this action stuff in a minute. And then yeah, like I say, we've just kind of built on top of that immediate mode UI system from the last thing. And I think other than that, I also added performance tracking, which we can talk about a little bit. So actually, if you were watching the last video, you probably were surprised to see me say nothing about Spall. So my original plan was to add a couple of simple timers to get, how long does it take to do things that we care about, and then to run an experiment. Let's see. Oh, I'm yawning. Oh. Run an experiment and see how this Spall thing works. The short answer is this worked super well, but our frame times are so short that almost everything that seemed interesting seemed to be directly caused by the instrumentation. I think this is probably something more worth doing when our frames per second or our millis per frame are, say, like 10, and we want to try to drag that back down, because then those sort of artifacts will vanish. Basically, what I was seeing was lots of stuff that was just like, hey, this render call took 20 times as long as everything else, and every single one of them is because the Spall buffer was being flushed. Right, their internal memory had filled up and they were clearing it, which is obviously going to happen. But it's because we've got basically 1,000 uninteresting calls with nothing to really look at. So experimented, may come back, but not yet. I did add some simple timers, so we can see in here, init fonts is taking about a second. I think we know that this is too slow. I have a plan to fix it, so that's all okay. Init render is 100 millis. I don't know if that's reasonable or not, so we have to give that a think at some point. And at the point that I added that, I also added a frames per second timer. in yeah. Alright, it's millis per frame is what I'm actually outputting. So at the time I added it, it was running at 2,000 frames per second. I come in here now, you can see, yeah, that's still about 2,000 frames per second, right? It's half a milli per frame. I think that does drop. I go to this frame, it's drawing a lot more, to 1 milli per frame, but we're drawing, what's this? I think it's 30 by 30. And then there's a backing quad and a character in front, so about 2,000, like, actual drawables on this screen. I think this gives me hope. This basically, the dumb plan we have for rendering, I think is robust enough to build the kind of game that I'm talking about building. I don't think we're ever going to have much more than this kind of order of magnitude of stuff in a screen. I have that toggleable though, because you can see it's very noisy. So, yeah, found that's useful. If you're following along and doing something similar, I found RenderDoc is also a very good way to get your frames per second, where there's no worrying about if you've done the maths wrong. Right? I think when I saw this number, I didn't really believe it. Whereas when RenderDoc spat it out, you're like, cool. So that was Spall. So after ruling that out, I was kind of like, do you know what we should do? Is just start building the game. Right? We've done all this code to draw letters and to draw boxes and to make things clickable. Let's start actually building something that looks like a roguelike. So what is there to say? My old code had a bunch of stuff hacked into it that I've basically just deleted and redone. We've got drawing the grid floor. We've got a click handler. I went back in and updated my render loop, which we can talk about in a moment. And then, yeah, these are kind of the next to-dos in my head. This is, I guess, how to get to a minimally sensible thing. I think actually probably this viewport thing is the next thing to work on, because currently we just show the entire level all the time. But I want the level to probably be significantly bigger than what reasonably fits on your screen. I also want you to be able to zoom in and out to get kind of like the level of detail that you want. Which again, so if I want to zoom in so I can see 5 by 5, well, then the 100 by 100 level won't fit. So we need some way to sort of detach those two concepts. So I think that's the next thing to work on. I made some notes as I was going. I guess this comes back to that idea. So some of this stuff was hacked in. So if you went back and looked at things in the last video, I had a mix of things being positioned from their top left and from their bottom left. And I found that very quickly got confusing. So we are now drawing everything consistently from the bottom left. This order of events business, you can see, I think, further in the notes, I start rambling about this. If we jump to our main loop, so this is, I guess, what's happening every frame. We are flushing the inputs. This is a bunch of like UI state. I guess you can watch the last video if you want to see what it's all doing. That's about handling, like hovering over and sort of making a thing ready to be clicked. Then we switch on the game mode to then go and actually draw a screen, which then, what's going on? This is the menu view that draws those two buttons. So this is, I guess, the simpler case. Me saying everything's been done from the bottom left, and I found the top left straight away. Never mind. But this is where the actual like UI drawing happens, right? So we set up a bunch of data about like where it's going to go, and then we go and draw the two buttons. And then each button call, so text button basically knows like how it wants to be drawn. So you can see in here it's working out what color it needs to make everything. It has a border. It draws a rectangle to make that border. It draws another rectangle that's smaller to make the background color. And then if it has text, it draws the text. And then it returns this thing. So what this thing is it's saying, did our UI system detect that this button got clicked? And if it did, we return true. So that this code that's calling it goes, oh, I was called, and it does the action. So in this case, it prints something, starts the game playing. All that order of events stuff that I've got that I'm rambling about is that the triggered state is actually depending on stuff that happened in the. Oh, I haven't got this right. So it was triggered means you hovered last frame and we detected a click last frame. So actually, maybe there isn't a frame of lag. I don't know. I've thought this round and round, and I convinced myself there was a frame of lag. And we could do this in a different order to have it happen more promptly. I'm increasingly unsure, which is irritating. But we can talk about that again in a minute. But one of the things that concerns me is if you think, so this I've left because it's very, very simple. But you can see it is mutating game state. If this were a more complex screen where, where as I click, I'm going to be moving the character, and the character moving into things may change how they look, we actually might have an issue, right? So if I go and find the playing view, you can see I've done something slightly different. I've introduced this kind of local concept of actions. I'm hoping to keep these sort of scoped within a single, like, big piece of UI that has a lot of mutation of state that it sort of itself depends on. If we come down here, really, it's the grid is the interesting bit in here. When you, where am I looking? If grid button. So here we have, so grid button is like text button, except it only draws the one character. It doesn't draw a string. And it lets you set the color. Instead of having it immediately fire off the thing to say, hey, you clicked the grid, am I next to the player? Am I a wall? Right? Like, instead of firing all of that off, we update this action state. And when we then come further down, you'll see draw player, I think, does something similar. So yeah, so we have an action click, we have a grid click, and then all our handling for how those should behave, it's done after drawing is finished. So it's not going to mutate the game state that is currently being used to work out how to draw things until everything for this frame is drawn. Which I think makes sense. I guess this is where the frame of lag comes in, right? It means then we could detect that there's been a click and do the update earlier. So then the update, you would see this frame that would we've pushed to next frame. I don't know. I think the long and short I've concluded is that what we've got is quite simple and works, and I think if it adds a frame of input lag, because of the kind of slow-paced nature of the game, we can probably justify that for simplicity. And if it ever feels bad, we'll come back and adjust. But yeah, that's where I've landed at the minute. So we'll probably end up seeing a lot more code in this area, or a lot more complications start coming up as the game builds out. But that's what it looks like currently. I did hit a fun issue, which is this get UID, so get unique identifier. The way that our UI system is working is, because it's immediate mode, we're not storing like a tree of all of the elements, right? That's, what do people call that? That's the non-immediate mode way of doing this. Which simplifies life because it means that you just go through, you have your current state, and you say, based on my current state, draw all of this. Where I guess the retained mode, I think people tend to call it. The other version, so the retained mode, I guess more like what you see a lot of in web dev, where you have the DOM sat there, and then you have code that can update things on the DOM. But the DOM is always just sat in the background, holding on to all the information about what's going to actually get drawn. So disadvantage of retain mode is it means that you've got a lot of state you have to keep up to date, right? You can't just update the thing and have it just spit everything out that you want. You have to both draw in your new thing and go back and fix the state on all of the existing things. Everybody says it gets very messy very quickly. I kind of imagine it gets messy very quickly. Whereas immediate mode, you just update the state that the drawing will be based upon, and it happens. I think a downside is it means it's less obvious how you're going to handle interactions that span over more than one frame. And that's where our kind of UI state comes in. So if I jump up here, these IDs are about tracking whether you were hovered or whether there was a mouse down on your box, or whether there was a full like mouse down and mouse up in your box over multiple frames. So this is how we're doing that, like hover and then active color on mouse down and then trigger on mouse up stuff. For this to work, we need a stable ID so that the same button getting drawn gets the same ID every time. And so I've got something very simple. I've written that takes a file, a line, and a differentiator. I see me leaving a comment in here. So this, I didn't think about this very hard. We're taking the file name, we're seeding with the line number, and then we realized too late that that doesn't fully cover us because the line number, if I think of the grid code, if I think specifically hits this, you have a for loop that hits the same line repeatedly to draw different buttons in different positions. So I'm creating a what's it here? A differentiator value that in this case will just be different for every one of those calls, and I'm XORing that into line because it just seemed like a way to combine the two numbers. It can't overflow. was basically my thinking. I think part of my problem is that D is just too small, and so when I do this XOR, there is too much of line that's left unchanged, and so it's possible to get things that are within the same file colliding quite easily. Actually, probably, now I've moved all of the gameplay code for the grid to another file, it will have changed these numbers, so I think that's why I'm not seeing it in that demo. But if I run the game again, I was seeing at like various points, if I highlighted the player, a random thing over here would also highlight. And what was the difference? Is there's in the same file, the player code was at a different line number, but clearly that line number was equal to the line number of some other place XOR'd with the differentiator. So I guess in this case, it's a row index of 0, so a good chunk of the stuff would just not get XOR'd. So I think we're going to have a bit of a think about this. I think it might be as simple as we just need to take D and generate a bigger random number out of it. But I don't know. I haven't thought about it yet. So that's on the to-do list. And I thought it was interesting. What else is there to say? Handmade Hero Day 196. 100% worth a look. I'd say I've got my money's worth out of Casey. So he basically is building a similar thing for his debug UI in his game. He's doing something smarter that avoids the, I guess, like the frame of lag introduced by our Z ordering. And I mean, he's just a very experienced programmer doing this. If you're watching this as like educational content, I think you probably get more out of Casey than out of me. But very useful. It's where I got the whole like click and drag onto a component idea from. So that's worth saying. What else is there to say? Yeah, then this is me worrying about the event loop. So I've already talked about that, pulling the code out into a separate handler. I was trying to get my head around exactly what happens in each run through of our main loop. So we have flush events that is going to take all of the user input that we care about and put it into a system where we understand what that data looks like, and then we iterate through them in order. And it uses the last frame's hover state to set the ID for trigger component's fire. Draw calls that like say where they should go on the screen, then do their bounds checking and depth test. That sets the next state's hover and then they also check if they were triggered. That's not based at all on whether they're currently hovered. It's based on whether they've been hovered last frame and there was a click event that happened. After a draw call is finished, we call our handler to avoid kind of mutating the state that we basically draw on, and then we draw. I think the thing you could do that's different is if you include a actual like ordering step. So we flush the events to set whatever state we need. I think Casey's version still has to set some piece of state to say like, is this thing hot that is persisted like frame to frame? You then have ordered draw calls so that you can do your draws from front to back. And what this means is the first thing we see, the first thing we see that has the mouse in it at the point that there was a click this frame, we can just immediately be like, well, you've been clicked. And so I think if you think about it, our triggered ID getting set is a way for us to get through an entire draw pass so we can do this depth check. If we drop that requirement, I think you can then do this within the frame. If you go and watch that Handmade Hero thing, that it does add some complication around. Essentially, what you then have to do is you have to say, well, was there a click this frame? Like, so at the start of the frame, was there a click? And then as you draw down, each interaction needs to consume some chunk of click. But what you could have is like a mouse down on a frame, but no mouse up, and a mouse up on a frame. So I think he has something like a half interaction count. And then items consume the interaction like events that they actually were triggered by. I think it's more complicated than what we're doing, and like I said, I think what we're doing will work for us, so we're going to keep going with it. But worth shouting out there. This can also be done just by manually putting code in the right order, right? So I think Casey's stuff, there's some like smartness about working out like the order elements get drawn. Or maybe actually it wasn't, because it's debug stuff that doesn't stack on top of each other. It just assumes that it's all at the top Z level. I can't remember. So in our code, we could quite easily, at this point in time, just manually put things in the right order so they always draw in the right order. That feels like it's going to be a headache for as the game gets more complicated, though. So we're avoiding that now. Yeah, that's me saying here. So the change in logic then means that when draw calls say, was I clicked, it's based on only state from this frame, which does feel like it's slightly better and probably more of a big deal in an action game, I think. But yeah, my conclusion, we're going to not care. Right, so I think that is the update. If I missed anything, feel free to ask in the comments, because I'm skimming around. I guess if you have any thoughts on how to make these videos better as well, I'd be happy to hear them in the comments. It's all a little bit more chaotic than when I was just writing the code live, but I'm finding this makes it much easier to fit into my day, so the things are actually happening. But yeah, hopefully when I see you next time, the game should be moving along nicely. Cool. See you then. Click the wrong button.